I'm Issy.
And we're going to be your main hosts for the Giving Voice podcast this year.
Just to let you know a little bit about us, we're both in our final year of the UCL MSc Speech and Language Sciences course, and we both studied linguistics for our undergraduate degrees.
One of us did venture a bit further to study. Issy only moved to Amsterdam for her degree, but I did travel all the way north to Leeds for mine.
Such a long way, Nathalie. We're super excited for all the amazing guests we have lined up. Not to give you too many spoilers for the year ahead, but we'll be chatting both to specialist therapists and to those who have benefited from speech and language therapy. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode.
And don't worry, we won't be hosting every episode, so hopefully you won't be too sick of our voices by the end of the year.
Who'd be sick of us, Nathalie?
I know.
Anyway, back to today's episode. Today we're joined by Carly Simonaitis, a specialist SLT in deafness.
Hi Carly, welcome to the Giving Voice podcast. Or perhaps I should say welcome back, since you actually ran the podcast while you studied at UCL.
I did, once upon a time, 2020 to 2022.
So cool.
So good. And that means really you are the podcast expert for today because this is only our first episode.
Yeah.
You're flattering me.
It's so great to have you on the podcast, Carly. And maybe just to begin with, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to becoming a specialist SLT in deafness?
Yeah, so I'm Carly. I used to go to UCL as well. That's where I did my master's. I didn't expect to fall into a deafness specialist role, and maybe fall into it isn't even the right terminology either. But I think it was always kind of brewing in the background for the opportunity to present itself. So if my accent doesn't give it away, I am from America. I'm from Chicago originally, born and bred there. That's where I did my undergrad studies. And in the United States, when you do a speech pathology course, you are training with future audiologist students as well during your undergrad. So when I was doing my undergraduate studies in speech and hearing science, we were learning a lot about audiology, the ear.
So interesting.
How to read audiograms like you do in the course, but it was expanded on a bit more.
Yeah,
because
amazing.
then when you go into your master's, as you need a master's to practice in the United States, then that's when the speech pathologists and the audiologists split to go and focus on their specialties. So I had done that undergraduate part of my degree, but after graduating, I went over to France and I was teaching in the Paris primary schools there. Yes, before I decided it was time to get that master's in speech and language therapy. Came to UCL, had those lectures that were in audiology. I was familiar with it, which was kind of nice. I was like, oh yeah, I get to relax a little bit in this part of the lecture. But then I also had the opportunity for an observational audiology placement. So I got to go down to South London and spend a week seeing pediatric and adult audiology in practice. And that was rather arranged because I came from the United States, making sure I would have the right competencies. But then when going to Hackney, so I work for Homerton Healthcare NHS Trust, and it's quite a large trust of speech and language therapists. There's a lot of us over there. And when I got started as a Band 5, I was in mainstream primary schools, so kind of like a generalist, a speech and language therapist. But then they would have these specialist teams for autism, stammering, deafness. And so a year into my role, there was an opening for deafness. I interviewed and went for it. And I think that my enthusiasm and interest to keep learning, I certainly didn't know everything when I was interviewing for that role, but I had some foundational knowledge. I showed that I was really wanting it and really willing to put in the work to learn, okay, how do I upskill myself to support this group of people?
Yeah.
And voila, there I am then. And that's where I am today, officially 1 year into the post.
Oh, wow, amazing. I actually wanted to ask about the interview because obviously you had the extra experience in America, but what sort of questions did they ask you? Because we don't talk a lot about deafness on the course in terms of the knowledge you need to be a deaf specialist. So what sort of questions were they asking you to get to that stage?
I remember I had to do a pre-interview task where I had to come up with a project for a secondary school, something about what was I going to support the deaf teenagers for helping them advocate for their needs in secondary school. And so you had 20 minutes and a giant piece of paper and markers to just kind of put something together.
Wow.
And then you had to present it as if you were presenting to, forgive me for some of the terminology, sometimes my American brain still gets turned around, but you're presenting to like the head teacher, the SENCO, teachers of the deaf, of, okay, this is the project of how they're going to advocate for themselves.
Oh, wow.
But then other questions on the interview. I believe that there was some relating, kind of like a Band 5 interview of what kind of interventions might you do to help support this like clinical vignette or this presentation of a child. Okay, considering their hearing equipment, how are you going to help support that their hearing equipment is being used and worn? This child has this level of deafness. How might that impact doing speech production work with them?
Oh, I see. Okay.
So it's kind of this extra layer of knowledge when it's almost like an extra lens that you're putting onto your glasses of like, okay, I'm looking at this clinical case that a speech and language therapist, any of us could pick up, but with a deafness lens and how might deafness now might be impacting language, speech, or social communication for that child.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, thank you. No, that's really interesting.
And so do you think that having your audiology experience from your undergrad really helped you to get this role? Or do you think that actually the skills that you gain just from doing the masters and being a newly qualified therapist would also be kind of enough preparation?
I think it's hard to say because I think that it gave me exposure to audiology and just being aware of it and its impact. But I also equally think if you're passionate and interested in something, then that really carries because you're very motivated then and you'll do the extra learning, you'll get stuck in, you'll be asking for support from maybe those specialist therapists anyway. You might even be drawn to a particular trust or hospital that offers that specialism. So I feel like it's twofold. It's maybe whatever exposure you've had in your clinical history, or it's kind of you get interested in something and then it's the opportunity to run with it.
I think that's so reassuring to hear as a student speech therapist myself.
Absolutely.
And for any listeners that actually, if we have something that we're passionate about or interested in, that we should chase after that and not feel restricted by past experiences.
No, I definitely think it's just running with it. If you have an interest in something, get stuck in. The nice thing about working in speech and language therapy is we're all generally very, very nice. We're very willing to help or have you on for an observation day or show you a little bit more about what it is that we do. So it's just about getting stuck in there. And I think, it doesn't matter what your past experience was. No, that's not inhibitory.
So good to hear.
Yeah, really, really good. So obviously your role is very varied and you're in a variety of settings. We just wanted to know, what does a typical working week look like for you?
Yes, so I should mention that at my hospital, their deafness team is quite small. We're a petite group of 3 therapists.
Oh, wow.
There's 2 who work in early years, so they're working with 0 to 5-year-olds. And then I'm the one supporting primary age and secondary age, and on the rare occasion, perhaps post-16 as well.
Wow.
So what does my typical work week look like? I have a mixed post where 3 days a week I'm in deafness and then 2 days a week I'm in mainstream primary. But that would be 2 days a week I'm going into a secondary school that has an in-house deaf support base. And so I have a very specific caseload of students who are coming to that secondary school for deafness support. Okay. So there's an in-house teacher of the deaf, there's a deaf instructor who comes, the specialist deafness soul to myself who comes in. And then I have 1 day a week, so that 2 days in that secondary school and 1 day a week where I'm supporting mainstream therapists. Because deafness isn't just in my one secondary school.
Yeah.
There's about 300 some deaf students that we're aware of in Hackney.
Oh, wow. That's a lot more than I would have expected.
And on a range from mild to profound, if you will. But my role then is offering very specific targeted support around deafness of, for these therapists who are in just a mainstream school, how can they be targeting language, speech, interaction, the environment to be as deaf supportive as possible.
Yeah.
That must take you around a lot of mainstream schools then, because
I get to do a dance around the borough, that's for sure. Yes.
So you mentioned there are only 3 of you on the team. Could you explain why there are 2 of you with the 0 to 5 age group?
So it's like when the baby's first born, you've got your newborn screening test, and that's identifying just generally, do they pass, or are we flagging that there's deafness here? And at that point, we are trying to support language acquisition as much as possible. I guess there's perhaps 2, because it's that idea that, even when the woman's pregnant, the baby will start to access sound before it's born. So once they're born, and then they have this newborn hearing test, and then they're just trying to really support that language acquisition, really support parent-child interaction at this level to adapt it so that child is still picking up the same skills. So it's really helping support the parents and those around the child to adapt their interaction style to the child.
Right.
Then be considering different options. Are we going to continue with spoken language? Do we want to do something where there is a cochlear implant? Or how do you want your child to be accessing language? So those kinds of discussions come up quite early. And that's their realm. And there's also teachers of the deaf who are immediately supporting as well. So there's a lot going on at that point in time. And then by the time they kind of come to see me, a lot of decisions have already been settled, the child settled, the family is kind of, we've made these tougher choices earlier. Perhaps.
Yeah. So do you work a lot with parents or less so, more with school staff?
I suppose in my current post, I do work with families, yes. But my primary collaboration is often in the schools themselves. There can be a lot of work on having teaching staff to be really familiar with how to be supporting a deaf student. Environmentally, are they sat up towards the front of the classroom? Is the teacher ensuring that they're wearing their radio aid? And is the radio aid worn at the right level on their chest? And can the student lip read? There's a lot of noise going on, and the teacher's in the corner disciplining a child. We've turned the radio aid off, so then the child who's deaf isn't getting all that noise while they're trying to focus and learn. So there's a lot of environmental bits in the school that I suppose I focus on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And so when you work in the deaf unit, do you work closely with the teacher of the deaf?
Yes, and I believe that you got to experience this a little bit yourself.
I did, yeah. So I had the amazing opportunity in March on my placement in Hackney to shadow Carly for the day. And that was, one of the reasons we really wanted Carly to come on the podcast, as it was a highlight of my placement, such an amazing experience.
Oh, well, I'm extremely flattered by that, and I'm very flattered still to be here. But I guess you got to see a little bit when you came along on that day that the Deaf Support Base, DSB as we call it, it's within the center of the secondary school there. And when I'm having my planning meetings at the beginning of the term, so this is September right now when we're filming, and so I've just had planning meetings with the teacher of the deaf looking at, what are the different interventions I'm going to be leading? What are your priorities? We also look together at there's something called the Deaf Curriculum, and it's kind of a guidance towards, okay, what sort of deaf-specific goals do we want our students to be achieving? Right. So there's a communication section on there, which includes kind of suggesting, okay, social interaction as well as advocating for themselves. So we'll look at that and kind of plan together of how many of these can we tick off? How many can you tick off? I tick off? Oh, the deaf instructor's coming in. How can we achieve as much on this deaf curriculum as possible?
Yeah.
And what is the difference between a deaf instructor, a deaf teacher?
Good question.
As someone who's not had the experience in Hackney.
No, definitely. That's a really good one. I think there's a lot of terminology that's used in speech therapy that can go over our heads sometimes. Yeah, a teacher of the deaf, sometimes referred to as a qualified teacher of the deaf, QTOD, or a TOD. This is a qualified teacher who's had additional qualification for deafness teaching, versus more a deaf instructor would be supporting. So like the deaf instructor we have in Hackney, she is deaf herself. And so she's really sharing a lot about her own experience growing up deaf, and is helping support the development of their deaf identity. So it's a collaboration there with a different angle of how we're supporting our deaf students.
Yeah.
That's so important, actually, to have someone deaf in that role, because it must be so... You feel more represented, I imagine.
Absolutely. There's a girl that I support, and her audiologist is deaf, and that was such a game changer for her to see, wow, like, look at this adult who also has hearing aids just like me. Having that representation and exposure, really, really cool and really important.
Yeah, so cool. And I also wondered, how much BSL do you know or do you use? And do you think you needed that to get the role that you have now?
I knew a little bit of American Sign Language from my undergraduate degree in the United States. But American Sign Language is completely different from British Sign Language. Yeah. Like two different languages completely there. But for my interview, I learned how to say, hello, how are you? Just like to have a little bit of sign.
Yeah.
And I was really worried in my case of, I don't know British Sign Language. How is that going to impact me getting into deafness? That even feels maybe a bit sticky of like not to know that. But in the case in my current role, my students, their families have chosen the oral language route or spoken language route of that's how they're communicating with their child. Yeah. Their child is in a mainstream school, so they are all accessing oral language for their learning. So my students really don't know sign language. They're aware of BSL, but they don't use it themselves. They are hearing aid and cochlear implant users.
Okay, that's also reassuring. And in terms of just working with deaf children, what makes the client group so special, do you think?
Besides the fact that they're all lovely.
Of course.
I really enjoy, it was my first exposure to certain interventions that I'd not done before. I don't know if you're familiar with smile therapy, but maybe you've learned about it on your lectures. But smile therapy is lots of role play. So any theater people out here might enjoy that element of it. But it's the idea where you're filming an interaction off the cuff without any preparation. And then afterwards, you're kind of analyzing that interaction and you're looking at which verbal and nonverbal communication skills were present. Right. And then you role play, you practice, slow it down, allow the students to pause, critique what's happening, and really break it down. And then they get to practice role playing themselves. And then you have a final filming at the end to see, wow, look at all this practice and role play that we have done. And then we look at your first video, the pre-test to the post-test, and how much skill development there's been. So I find it really special to work with this client group because we can get into this kind of nitty-gritty social interaction bit. They're all oftentimes very keen and wanting to like learn how to get it right. But they've just been kind of not able to grasp onto those cues.
Right,
and you're breaking it down for them and making it really clear. And then they're able to successfully have some of these interactions, like asking directions from a passerby or a college interview. And I just did another round of pre-test filming with some of my year 11s, and they remembered so many skills from year 10. So it was so
that's
amazing. Good to see. Yeah. So it's, they're a special group of very motivated kids, certainly the ones that I work with.
Yeah, and would you say that smile therapy is your favourite intervention?
Ooh, good question.
I can't play favourites here. I do love smile, but I also really find shape coding quite interesting. So like you have colorful semantics as almost your baseline formulating the formula of your sentence. Yeah. And then shape coding's taking it up a level to really highlight different parts of grammar. And you can have so much creativity with that then of what kind of sentences are you building? Yeah. With my deaf students, we also try to develop their world knowledge quite a bit. So we'll take different current events articles and then we'll formulate sentences with the shape coding symbols. So it's very creative, very interactive. Yeah. So that's quite fun too.
Yeah. It's interesting because we use shape coding in mainstream schools as well with other children. So why do you choose shape coding specifically with deaf children?
Very good question. So I guess it's one of those really nice interventions that can overlap for different areas of need. Why we're using it in deafness, it's helping to visualize spoken language. So depending on your levels of deafness and what access to sound you have, you might be missing certain things. Like you might be missing those past tense ed endings, plurals, sometimes articles like or the. So you're making this very visual for them to kind of grab onto those concepts.
Makes sense.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, really. So I'm going to go back to something you said earlier, that in your week you also spend a day supporting other therapists who might have deaf children on their caseload. Could you tell us a little bit about how you'd work with them?
Yeah. So when I have this mainstream support day, it is either helping that therapist indirectly or directly. Okay. Or maybe I should say it's either I'm helping the child indirectly or directly. Right. So if I were to be doing something indirect, it would be the SLT is presenting the case to me, the areas of difficulty, and I might be suggesting some environmental strategies. Again, ensuring that that child is sat at the front of the classroom, making sure that their hearing equipment's being worn. If it's not being worn very consistently, maybe let's introduce something like reward charts and make it really motivating and fun to be wearing the equipment. We might link with audiology. If the child is kind of finding it uncomfortable, maybe the equipment isn't tuned correctly, so it is a bit harsh on their ears. So we're supporting, how do we support the child to access their sound as best as possible? Yeah. Sometimes in deafness, it can be a bit blurry as to what's going on. So some children, maybe deafness was newly identified, so they're default seeing certain behavior difficulties in the classroom and they're not really sure what they're seeing. But it might be because the child is having trouble to access the sound, and so we have to support, be sure to, like, recommending strategies to use their name to redirect their attention towards the teacher before giving an instruction, using visuals as much as possible. Yeah. So environmental bits and bobs. And then for direct support, I would come in for a specialist block of intervention if needed. Okay. So one case that I was supporting at the end of last year was helping to embed a core board into the classroom.
Right, okay,
Yeah, and so that's a bit more particular. And so it was me and the link therapist, or the therapist that worked there in the school. Yeah. I would join up forces with her, and we were collaborating together of how to get the child used to the board with motivating activities, then bringing that board into the classroom, training the class teacher and support staff of how to use the core board interactively with her. So there's some more specialist blocks as well. including one that I'm about to start doing as well for oral rehabilitation for the teenager who just got her cochlear implants, and kind of like retraining. You're kind of helping to support that retraining of the brain's access to sound and how it hears the world around them. So a bit more specialist. So that's then where I come along.
Very interesting. Also reassuring to just hear that there's people that we can go to when we're working in teams to actually help support those children on our caseload.
Yeah, and I should mention too that it can vary based from trust to trust.
Yes, of course.
Who's there. But if you still have an interest area, there's these things called clinical excellence networks that you can find through the Royal College of Speech Language Therapists, the RCSLT website.
Yeah.
And you can link in there, and they'll have different events, and you can be networking with other specialists too to try to get that support. So
great.
Amazing. No, really interesting.
Yeah. Carly, it's been so great to chat to you today. I feel like we could talk for hours, but for the last question, what would your piece of advice be to any current student speech and language therapists?
I think that for any current students, you never know what your first job's going to bring you. You never know where you might go. I don't think I anticipated becoming getting into a niche area so early on in my career. But if you're interested in something, get stuck in.
Yeah.
Take advantage of the opportunities that present itself to you. Also create the opportunities. Dig around on the internet, link up, network where you can, and your learning doesn't stop when you finish the course. It's definitely going to keep going, and that's the exciting part too.
No, perfect. I think it's been such a reassuring episode for anyone who wants to go into a more specialist role and perhaps doesn't know how to get there, or thinks that they don't have the right preparation for it. So really, really thank you. Yeah,
so interesting. Yes, thank you so much for joining us today, Carly.
And thank you for having me, both of you. It was a pleasure to be back on the other side this time.
Yeah, as the experts.
Yes.
And if you want to hear more from Carly, keep your eyes peeled for an upcoming episode all about working abroad as a speech and language therapist, where we're lucky to have Carly back on the podcast sharing her words of wisdom.
And if you can't wait until then, check out episode 10, where Carly herself hosts an episode on the topic.
Thanks for listening, and speak to you again soon.
Bye.